If you've ever tried talking to executives, you know they speak a completely different language. The way they communicate and the way they expect you to communicate follows its own set of unspoken rules. In this video, I'm breaking down the 5 essential principles for communicating effectively with executives, because when you're trying to connect with senior leaders, your real goal isn't just to get your message across, it's to earn a place in their inner circle, and that's something you can only get by invitation. So if you worry that executives don't see that you're quiet out of principle and that you hate playing politics, and instead fear that they just assume you're quiet because you've got nothing worth listening to, then this video is for you. So let's go through the 5 rules that will help you communicate effectively and get an invitation to the inner circle. For each of these principles, I've made these cards. I'll explain what the rule is, why it matters, and how you should effectively communicate. So let's start with rule number 1. Avoiding the details. If you've ever found yourself across from an executive, heart racing, eager to prove that you belong, then you know the instinct. List everything that you've done. You want to show off your tasks and prove you're thorough by discussing the details, but that instinct is the exact thing that's holding you back. And it's not your fault. The system literally trained you to do this. From day one in our careers, we've been trained to speak in tasks. We've been rewarded for checking boxes, following steps, and basically getting things done. So when the moment comes to show our value, we fall back on the list. But that's for the implementers and the contributors, basically the lower tiers of the ladder. But you don't want to be seen as this. You want to escape these tiers and move up. So why does this matter? Well, you should avoid giving all the details because executives don't speak that language anymore. They've moved on past the minutiae. The higher you go, the less people care how you did it. They just want to know why it mattered. Executives operate in outcomes, not actions. They care about the direction and not the detail. When you list every single thing you've done, they don't see excellence. They see someone who hasn't made the leap, someone who's still at the individual contributor level. And being seen as someone who's escaped the implementer level matters because when you fail to show it, you don't just bore the executive you're trying to communicate with, you lose the chance to be seen as a peer. And when that happens, you walk out of the room exactly how you walked in, someone who executes, not someone who leads. So what should you do instead? If you want to be taken seriously at that level, you have to change how you communicate. Stop proving you're busy and instead start showing that you're strategic. Stop talking like someone who does the work and start talking like someone who understands what the work is for. That's how you stop sounding like an employee and start sounding like an executive. Now, avoiding details will get you noticed, but you've got to do more to get an invitation to the inner circle. And rule 2 is where you'll get remembered, because it doesn't matter how strategic your message is no one can follow it. So that means that rule number 2 is clarity over context. One of the biggest habits professionals struggle to break is over-explaining. You want to show your thinking, so you unpack the entire story, the background, the context, and the steps that led you there. But executives don't have the luxury of story time. So why does this matter? Well, executives operate under constant time pressure. Their days are tightly scheduled with little room for extended narratives. In that environment, clarity is essential. What they're listening for is simple. They want to know what's the issue, what's the opportunity, and what do you need from them? When a message arrives slowly, wrapped in background information and context, it's not going to land. Executives will start to disengage, and the key point, if it ever comes at all, will be overlooked and rushed. In contrast, clear and direct communication helps decision makers stay oriented. When someone leads with the main idea, it signals respect for their time and an understanding of what matters at that level. Over time, that behavior builds trust, and trust tends to bring more visibility, responsibility, and influence. And when that happens, you begin to enter the inner circle. So what should you do? So if you're aiming to be more effective with executive audience, one shift can make a notable difference. Start with the point. Anchor your message early. Offer context only where it adds precision. Let them ask questions of you if they need additional information. And as an added bonus, being able to answer their questions also signals how much you know about your work. So time is limited, and how you use it tells people how you think. But what if you had someone in that inner circle, an executive career mentor, to give you advice and answer your questions? Because you can with this newsletter. Every week I sit in my office and send a short, no fluff email sharing lessons on career growth, influence, and building the kind of income and reputation that compounds over time. And my favourite part is reading your replies that go directly to me. I'll leave a link to that below so you can sign up and get some tips before your next meeting. Anyway, clarity earns you a seat at the table, but this next rule is what makes people listen when you speak. And so rule 3 is don't think in silos. The fastest way to sound junior, even when you're doing great work, is to talk about it in silos. When you talk about your work and contributions without connecting it to anything larger, you're signaling that you don't yet see the full picture, and that signal matters more than you think, because executives live in trade-offs. Growth versus cost, speed versus risk, short-term versus long-term. They think in systems. So when you describe your work in isolation, it tells them that you don't yet see those connections. And when you don't speak in those systems, you're not seen as part of the decision-making layer. You're seen as someone who still needs direction. But why does that matter? Well, when you're not demonstrating big picture thinking, you risk doing valuable work, but it gets overlooked, underleveraged, or disconnected from strategy. And when that happens consistently, you don't just lose visibility, you lose momentum too. So what should you do instead? Well, reframe how you communicate. Start linking everything you do, no matter how small, to what the business is trying to achieve. Show how your work supports revenue, mitigates risk, or improves customer outcomes, or advances the broader strategy. Because when you do that, the perception shifts. You're no longer just delivering or implementing at the lower levels of the career ladder, you're steering and showing ownership. That's how you stop sounding like someone who works in the business and start sounding like someone who helps drive the business forward. And once you start thinking in systems, you're no longer part of the noise, you're part of the signal. But there's a new trap waiting just after that one that quietly kills your credibility even if your thinking is sharp, which is rule number 4. Avoid lazy escalation. One of the most common mistakes I see, especially at junior and mid levels, is what I call lazy escalation. It's when you show up with a problem and nothing else. I see this all the time when I'm in executive meetings. People come in and say something like, "We've hit this roadblock," or "I've encountered this problem," and then silence. They don't have a point of view or a proposal, just a problem left hanging in the air. And that is known as lazy escalation because you bring in a problem or an obstacle and you've done nothing to try and solve it. So why does this matter? Well, executives already know the business is full of challenges. Their world is complexity. But pointing out a problem without offering a path forward doesn't position you as thoughtful, it positions you as a dependency. Pointing out problems won't make you insightful, but offering a path forward does. Because at that level, they're not looking for people who need direction. They're looking for people who lighten the cognitive load. People who come in with options and trade-offs and proposals, even imperfect ones. What contributor level employees don't understand is every time you flag an issue without suggesting a way forward, you're sending a subtle signal that you need someone else to solve your problems. And over time, that signal will compound. You become the person who surfaces friction but doesn't resolve it, which makes you the friction. So what does right look like? Well, you can still point out the problem, but you also bring a possible next step. You lay out a trade-off. You show you've thought about how to move through it. Even if your suggestion isn't the one they go with, it doesn't matter because what matters is you're signaling that you don't stop at obstacles, you think in outcomes. That shift is what sets people apart because when executives see that in you, they stop seeing you as someone who needs help and someone who's just at a contributor level, and they start seeing you as someone they can trust with more. Once you start bringing in solutions, you've crossed a major threshold. You've stopped being a dependency, but there's still one final mistake that separates those who influence decisions from those who just attend a meeting. And it's the most important rule of all. So rule 5 is always land the plane. It's a mistake I see constantly, even among high performers. They'll bring in the ideas, the solutions, and the data, but then do nothing with it. And what you've just done, without realizing it, is hand back the keys. You've done all the thinking, but you haven't stepped into ownership. You presented like a contributor and not a driver. And here's why that matters. Executives are looking for people who don't just bring the right inputs, but know how to carry them through. When you leave a meeting without locking in the next steps or assigning ownership, You send an unspoken signal that you're there to execute, not lead. And that's exactly how they're going to categorize you, as a helpful implementer, but not ready for more. So what should you do? If you want to break through that ceiling, you've got to do one thing that most people skip, and I call it landing the plane. You need to be the one who says, here's what we'll move forward with, or let's lock in a quick check-in next week to align. I'll draft the proposal and loop back by Friday. The thing junior employees don't understand is execs won't remember every data point or update, but they will remember who drove the room forward, and when you leave the room with momentum, you stand out from your coworkers, which is the key to advancement. If you want to know the other 10 ways to get ahead of 99% of your coworkers and be invited to the inner circle, then you should watch this video next, where I explain just that.